It's my pleasure now to do the panel on potential benefits and risks from generative AI. We've talked a lot about AI, but we're going to get our heads around it. I'm going to introduce this, our facilitator for this panel, Daniele Quercia, who's the Director of Responsible AI and Research Manager for Augmented Human Interaction at Nokia Bell Labs. He's got the coolest professorial title I've heard, Professor of Urban Informatics at King's College London. And he self-titles on his Twitter account that he is, quote, a promiscuous cross-disciplinary scientist. So he's perfect for this audience. It's my pleasure to introduce Daniele Quercia.
Thanks so much, Alan. I didn't know people read the Twitter bios, but now I know. All right, how are you feeling? Who is feeling good? That's the last panel, so the energy should be there. We have a plan, I guess. Yes, we do. So actually, we are at King's College, and here is actually, from this perspective, the room is beautiful. It's very different. You guys should try to actually look from this side. Not now, actually, later. But from King's College, Alan Turing graduated, and today on the Nature website there was a news piece saying that the Turing test was broken by ChatGPT. So there is no dinner, no meeting nowadays where people don't mention ChatGPT, and therefore we're going to mention ChatGPT. In particular, we're going to talk about generative AI, and the plan is very simple. Simple people. So we're going to say, what is generative AI? Why it matters for misinformation? And obviously, there will be challenges. How to tackle the challenges of generative AI and misinformation. And for that, for what is generative AI, Stevie. We have Stevie from DeepMind, Google. She's a senior research scientist in the ethics research team. Excellent. Then we have Sarah, who is going to explain why generative AI matters for misinformation. Sarah is a lecturer in law at Stanford Law and a manager of content policy at Meta. And then finally, we're going to see how we can tackle the challenges with Joe, who is the Deputy General Counsel at McKinsey. And we hopefully we're going to keep it short, so that you guys can actually ask the interesting questions, because I'm a totally uninteresting guy, so I won't ask any interesting questions, so I just move and open the floor, which I think is a much better plan than me asking questions. So let's start. Stevie, you're going for it. What's generative AI?
So let's see. First off, thank you. Thank you for letting me be here. I'm very happy to be here and discussing this critically important topic and hearing everybody else's views and questions throughout the day. To give kind of some context on where I'm coming from this, I come at these questions from a responsible AI, a socio-technical, an ethical AI lens, but also a research lens. But I have some technical background. So I've been tasked with this particular question. And I feel like a lot of it was somewhat covered by the last panel. And maybe we all have a sense of what we're talking about. But to just kind of like lay the groundwork, because my memory is terrible these days, I'm just gonna make sure I stay on track. So when we say generative AI or Gen AI, we're typically referring to AI models that can create something, say, a bit of text that's in the form of a poem, or answering a question, or audio like a video, audio like a song, or a person saying something, or a video. So it's actually creating something that maybe didn't already exist. There is generally a different mechanism for that generation than, say, retrieving something. Like if we ask for something in a true quote, or a picture that exists that someone took is retrieved, so like similar to a search function. Though you might have seen some generative AI chatbots say, you ask it for a quote and it gives you one. This is a capability that's being created or being actively put out there. There is just about always a prompt or some seed or directive for the generative AI. So this could be a user asking a question to be answered, just saying hello, or making a command or statement such as make a duck riding a horse image or whatever. And there's a reason that chatbots or large language models are sometimes called sort of glorified autocorrect. However, that's likely too simplistic, especially for our purposes as people who are trying to understand and gate these systems to some extent. And if we kind of stop our understanding there at a glorified autocorrect, we might limit our ability to understand what they do and critique them or gatekeep them properly. So essentially, large language models, chatbots, conversational AI, they work by predicting the next token, it's called. So from patterns in training data, where all a token is a bit of text. So it could be a syllable of a word itself, a clause, a sentence. How much text, say for a large language model, the length of that actually matters for what you're creating, and it's actually a really key component of doing multilingual chatbots well. And then once a suite of possible responses to the user are generated, the system might then check against the rules it needs to follow or have companion moderating AIs giving how likely any possible response is to, say, be misinformation or hate speech. Maybe all these possible responses are given probabilities that they could be hate speech or some other policy violating or something like that. And then one is chosen, and that is what's put out to the user. But there are several ways in which these systems can be gated or moderated, and maybe we'll get more deeply into that when we actually talk about mitigation techniques. But for example, there's having a set of fairly plain language rules. For example, do not pretend to have a body, or do not make an image of the Prophet Muhammad. And then these rules can be applied by basically telling the language model in a few-shot learning setting. That means just giving it a few examples and then letting it run. Or what's commonly called reinforcement learning with human feedback, which can really range in what's meant by that. But it essentially means getting some human feedback and then having that change the model in some way and reinforce it. Like the Facebook like button is an example of where there's some human feedback. You're giving it some feedback, you like this, say, and then that circulates, and then maybe you get more information like that. But it ranges. So now, just very quickly, some other terms that I think are really important because they're going to come up. If not today, then in the future. There's multimodal. And when people talk about a mode, this means text, say, like a chatbot is a text language generator, video generation, image generation, these are all modes. Now, something that is being worked on and rapidly advancing is multimodal, so being able to do multiple of these. And it has particular implications for how to do this well, how to limit misinformation or disinformation, and what misinformation or disinformation even looks like. There's also something called multi-agent, which is the study of, or trying to understand the effects when these models actually interact with each other. And so there's a lot of concerns around, say, releasing multiple flavors of something like ChatGPT into the world, and then they talk to each other and things happen. And so multi-agent effects is something that is potentially of future concern. And these are, in the end, like Facebook has come up, TikTok has come up a lot in these conversations and panels. And in a way, I do sometimes think of something like ChatGPT or DALL-E, these generative systems, as platforms, not especially for human content, but for content. And so that's one way in which it's not always thought in the field of ethical AI, responsible AI, thinking about generative AI. They're not always thought of as platforms, but it helps in a framework to think about their amplification effects, for example. So I'll stop there.
All right, thank you so much for the intro. So then, Sarah, so what this information has to do with this ability to automatically generate content and to get feedbacks with the reinforcement learning and to be generate the perfect content for a specific individual, for example? Why does it matter?
Yeah, so first of all, thank you. I'm really thrilled to be here. Maybe a little bit of context about my background. I'm an international lawyer by training, and whoever is in international law knows that Cambridge is a very special place for the genesis of international law. So even though we're in a business school and accounting setting, but it's a really special place for me to be. So I come from a platform and academic perspective, and maybe I give you a little bit of color of the type of work that I do for Facebook specifically. I am on the content policy team, which is the team that develops the rules of what our users are allowed to share on the platform, so essentially the rules of the speech. And my function is essentially to be the bridge between academia, between civil society organizations and the broader policy community to bring their expertise and insights when we're developing our policies, specifically how we think about addressing misinformation. So going back to your question in terms of what does Gen AI have to do with misinformation and how we should think about it, we in trust and safety community really are wired to only think about risks. And even though the title of the panel says benefits, but like I sit here and we're already kind of wired to talk about risks. But our previous panel did a good job of outlining some of the benefits, and I want to start with that before I go to the risks. We have been, as a tech company, as an online platform company, have been relying on AI for quite a lot. And without AI, we cannot do content moderation at scale in a timely fashion. So I don't want us to sort of forget the fact that we need AI, and it's really critical in our ability to do content moderation in a fast and informed way. One area that is helpful, for example, AI can actually proactively identify and detect harmful content, be it hate speech or harmful behavior, be it mass production of fake accounts, and then or content on terrorism content, and then take it down before even thousands of users report or even see that. So there is an enormous benefit to AI systems, and it would be interesting to see how generative AI systems in particular are going to contribute to content moderation. Now, when they think about the risks, and this theme has already been coming in this throughout the day, it's really about the volume and the ways in which Gen AI can basically compromise the integrity of information ecosystem by giving bad actors the tools to create really authentically looking false images, false videos. And the second part of it, again, going back to your points, what the models can do is around hallucination. So essentially, these models can create wrong or false responses to users' prompts that may seem trustworthy. So in my role, as I said, I talk a lot with experts, and for the past month or so, I've been talking to over 100 experts to understand how to better understand these risks and ways to mitigate it. And one thing, again, that came over and over again, it's really going to be about scale and about sort of the volume, and not so much necessarily that we have novel risks. But again, I'm going to put a footnote here because it's an evolving space. Who knows, maybe in a month or so we have new risks out there. And I think from that perspective, I'll just quickly touch upon our current approach to Gen AI content and specifically misinformation, and then I'll pass it to you, Joe. So just to start, like, we have community standards, which is our rules or norms of what we do not allow on our platform, on Meta platforms, and it doesn't matter whether something has been created by AI or human, we will still apply our norms. So in other words, if a hate speech is generated by an AI or by human, we will still apply as long as it violates our policy. So in other words, it's really we're focusing here on harms. When it comes to misinformation, we have three-pronged approach to addressing misinformation. We call remove, reduce, and inform. So remove is when we would remove the misinformation that will lead to imminent physical harm, and we work with civil society organizations across the globe to help us bring that context. The second is we will work with our third-party fact checkers, and we've heard from Full Fact, and they will rate and identify and rate content. They also will rate and identify content that is manipulated, that is synthesized. And lastly, it's super important to give more context and inform users, be it in the forms of like transparency or nudges or information panels, so that users themselves can better understand what they are consuming. So I think in all those three categories, there are lots of opportunities and also challenges for Gen AI, but I'm going to let Joe chime in now.
Sure. Well, I think I will probably move to, I think, methods of tackling, if that makes sense. You know, I think building off of what Sarah said, I think as we've talked about it, and I think individually, I don't want to speak for everyone up here, but I think we all agree, for the most part, what we're going to see out of generative AI is not a massive difference in its impact on disinformation, right? But instead, as we've already said, right, brings down the cost dramatically, right, which has a significant impact on scalability and size, and then of course on quality, right? And so when we think about, you know, what are the methods of tackling, I think you're not going to see methods of tackling it that are dramatically different than other methods, right? And I think there are probably four categories, right? There are the regulations, which I'll touch on in a minute and try to be brief. There are the technical controls that I think everyone up here can speak to. There's the education, of course, that needs to go along with it. And then I think corporate codes and corporate codes of conduct are going to play a significant role, and I can touch on that as we talk about the regulations. I think, you know, in the regulatory space right now, we're seeing a difference of approach that largely mirrors like what we saw out of privacy, right? Particularly when we see different governments' approach to this. In the EU, you're seeing a product-based approach to regulation. What you're seeing is largely an AI framework that's going to divide generative AI or AI more broadly into four main categories, right? You're going to have your banned applications, right, which are typically going to be those applications that, public remote use of biometric identification, social scoring, harm to children, typically are going to fall in the banned use category. Most of what we're talking about is going to fall into the next two categories, which are high-risk applications. There are 8 categories of those. I'm not going to run through them, but you can think of high risk as things like law enforcement applications, biometrics outside of the banned applications. Interestingly, for this audience and for this particular panel, it is the limited risk application, the third tier down, where deepfake technology or generative technology is typically going to fall when it's not going to fall in the upper two categories. So technology that is creating content, right? So chatbots, video generation, et cetera. And then you're going to have your minimal risk applications, which is everything else, right? Briefly, how is that going to play out in the way that the regulations themselves are looking? This band is obvious, right? That's going to be out. High risk, you're going to see an overlap between the high risk approach and I think the corporate codes, right? I think they're going to influence each other significantly. In the high risk side, it's going to be a lot about how you build, govern, and maintain the applications, right? So those companies that are responsible for building the models, the underlying foundational models and the applications that make use of them are going to have major obligations to ensure quality of data, right? To ensure transparency of use and transparency of generation, a whole set of things they will need to do as they deploy these. In the next tier down, the limited risk area, which again, a lot of the generative technology is going to fall, typically the impact is going to be focused on transparency, right? So the idea, at least under the EU, will be focusing on transparency, both transparency of use and transparency of source, right? And so I think you will see that, again, as the primary focus on the corporate side. I think if we look very briefly around what other countries are looking to do, you see a similar, again, as I said, breakdown between the privacy space. So in the UK and in the US, Singapore, Japan, a lot of other areas that are looking at AI regulations, you're looking at a much more principle-based approach. I don't think, whereas some people would view the EU regulations as product-based, right, specific use cases. In other countries, you are seeing principles that need to be applied in development. And so again, a lot of those principles are going to be fairly similar to the high-risk sources, right? Ensuring you have an eye towards misuse, ensuring, again, data governance and data quality. Again, a lot of those concepts that are going to be built into all applications. And again, at least in the US, for example, we're seeing a much more, for the moment, a little bit more of like a voluntary-like approach. There are there's a great AI risk framework from the National Institute of Standards and Technology in the US. There's a White House Bill of Rights, around AI. And as we saw in just in the last week, we're seeing, the seven big players in the space signing up for those voluntary sort of Bill of Rights concepts in their development. And then I think finally, maybe just on the regulatory space, we'll see a totally different approach in some countries. China is a particularly interesting example where I think the focus out of China has been much more on disinformation and misinformation, right? Where the focus has been on particularly generative AI models, deep synthesis technology, its ability to generate videos, music, voices, et cetera. And again, the focus there is being applied both to the developers of the content and to the users, right? Where you see on the development side a focus on transparency and sourcing, and on the user side a requirement to label where content came from. Again, that's a particular regulatory space of its own. I think maybe the last thing I'll say on this, and then curious to see on the technical side what people are seeing that is going to impact how generative AI is going to be, managed. Let's put it that way in this space. I think interestingly, out of China, we're also seeing a focus in the regulations on identity authentication, right? And so again, as we think far ahead in the future, that's also another thing that people will be thinking about, probably less outside in some areas in the regulatory space, although I think we will see it, and certainly in the technology space, you might hear terms like proof of personhood or other ideas around identity verification and the ways technology can actually help make sure that content is being traced back to a person rather than a machine, right, or to specific people. I'll pause because I think others may have some interesting things to say about the technology side of what you're deploying.
Yeah, I also kind of want to round out the risks as well, because I do think that there's one that wasn't really touched upon, which is, so certainly there's, like the most straightforward one is amplification, right? This is kind of making it, like lowering significantly the barrier to putting out what I think was brought up in the last panel as plausible information or even kind of persuasive or influencing information, even something as simple as like asking ChatGPT or a generative AI system to summarize an article. Of course, if you have a 10,000-word article, you have a 5,000-word article, whatever, a small summary is maybe not going to cover all the sides. And so there's a lot of choices being made within making even that simple summary on what to show, what to amplify from that article that's being placed out there. And so there's a lot of kind of like subtle kind of amplification that is likely to happen, a kind of like, I think I heard this described recently as like kind of almost more cultural amplification sometimes. For example, there was some reporting out there around the fact that the kind of American smile, like what the smile means in the US is being kind of amplified and put out through DALL-E, and the images of, say, if you generate a picture of Russian soldiers from 100 years ago or something, they might have them all sitting there smiling widely, which is probably not what would have actually happened when you compare it with truth. And also how different cultures are represented. There's been some work around how different Islamic cultures are represented across the world. And so there's a lot of kind of maybe more, some obvious, but some subtle, that can really influence the space. But then also, as more of this content gets out there, it's a bit different from the amplification of human misinformation, human-generated misinformation that's out there, which is that it's not human. It's in the end knowing whether or not this is human, what the kind of information space, who is it coming from, that like being able to operate and knowing where these things come from and who is actually putting this out there into the like political discourse, say, is quite important to how we operate. And that could significantly change in the future as these take more speed. I can jump into technical mitigations, but I also, okay. So, of course, there's a bunch of levers in the legal space. In the technical space, there are a bunch of kind of mitigations that I wouldn't call any of them full solutions. We all know that this is an extremely hard space, and sometimes it's as simple as coming down to like what is truth, right? I'm sure any fact checker could agree with me on that. And there's a lot of, say, technical levers that are roughly similar to moderation. Say you have a classifier that sits on top of a generative AI system that is giving the likelihood that this is misinformation, but then you have to train that classifier. And when you train that classifier, you are having, say, people annotate content, deciding what is and isn't true. And there's a lot of things that go into that annotation and a lot of details that are important to actually deciding, is this true or not? And of course, like, as we know from the last panel, fact-checking is not easy. And if you have annotators in a space where they have to look at content, don't have a lot of time, and have to decide quite quickly, they may not always get it right. They may come at it from a particular point of view. They may not notice subtle misinformation. So there's a lot that can go into this that makes it quite difficult. So robust detection mechanisms are really important. Both when it's a generative AI system, but also when there is, or also limiting a generative AI system if you're from the developer side, so that it puts out more factual information. And even this is maybe kind of like an obvious mitigation, but just ensuring that as these systems are developed, that there is an emphasis on factuality, say, over engagement. Keeping someone talking to the generative AI and them enjoying the system, perhaps, versus, say, maybe small corrections or ensuring that what is said is somewhat neutral and factual, rather than, say, presenting it such as the chatbot is an expert and having it go one direction or another. And then there's a lot of transparency mechanisms, and perhaps even limiting personalization is something that we might want in our space. Because, of course, there's a lot of course, our typical information sphere is opening an internet page, looking at an article, looking at a forum that a lot of other people see. But if we're talking to a chatbot and we're getting our information from that chatbot, then the information that I'm consuming might be different, and in fact is probably quite different from what Joe might consume, or you might consume as you talk to a chatbot that's a slightly different one. So there's a lot of things that we can hopefully do in that space and that we can push for.
Perhaps I can add some color from the detection and transparency from sort of platform perspective. I mean, we've been talking a lot about Gen AI and its potential risks and benefits, but one thing that I felt that we need to sort of acknowledge is the challenge of detection. According to media forensics experts, and I caveat at the moment, we don't have really consistent way of detecting Gen AI generated content and do it at scale and in a timely manner. There are ways in which I know that industry and academia is working to bring watermarking tools, and if you embed those watermarking tools in the code base, then it is more likely than not that online platforms would be able to detect. And as you have seen, as Joe also mentioned, a number of big companies, including Meta and Google and OpenAI, has agreed on voluntary commitments to do that watermarking techniques. So that's an important space to be watching to help us with the mitigation. And I think it's also to help us with just providing that context and transparency. And this is the second point I wanted to make. There is a lot of conversation and there is a lot of urge for transparency and for platforms to be able to label the generative AI content. When I have been talking to many experts, I've kind of heard arguments of both sides. Label as much as you can, whatever you can, mostly because that will give an opportunity to inform users, to educate, and this is such a norm-setting sort of period, so people need to understand how those technologies work. But there is also a legitimate argument in favor of opting for a more selective regime, and mostly because you can, with a selective regime, you can also account for false positives and also try to mitigate a misconception that if something is not labeled, it's authentic, hence true. So there is this dichotomy. And one thing that we haven't really touched upon, which I think is absolutely critical, what I would describe is how much is enough to make to say that this is sufficiently generated. Content creators have been using different tools, and one may argue those tools were editing. So the question is, where is that line from editing turns into generated content, which is going to really be critical for platforms and for companies and to understand where their interventions come in. And I do believe that's probably the space maybe for academia and civil society organizations and regulators to come up with some definitions and shared sort of concepts. So with that, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, guys. Now also there are PE issues about the training data, right? So if you're training your models with my own data, then how do we make sure that we can technically understand how the training has been done? But, as I promised, we have 20 minutes for questions. So I will open the floor, and I will ask anybody who has got a meaningful question to raise his or her hand. Thank you.
Hi. Bonnie Rushing from U.S. Air Force Academy. My question is for Stevie. What would happen if multiple Gen AI platforms talk to each other?
A party. No.
So I think a lot about what helps me grasp these kind of general questions like this is thinking about, say, particular case studies. I also tend to try and think about extreme but realistic cases. So the one that comes to mind here are, say, the case of what if in the future generative AI is used to gate access to welfare. There have been cases in the US, say, where I don't think, it wasn't generative AI, but it was some kind of automated system was used to, I think this is Indiana and Arkansas, was used instead of, say, a call center. So people who maybe had some problems getting their welfare payment or welfare access, some change was made to it, they were trying to call the call center to ask questions, to get changes in talking to a human, where there's flexibility, where there's compassion. We all know from trying to call our cable company or whatever, that the first thing I do when I hear a robot on the other line is I yell, send me to a person, basically. And in this case, there essentially was no person, right? So they were just going through loops, and people actually died from not getting the welfare access that they needed. Now, what if the only way what if it was a generative AI that company was using or that government was using because it cut costs? And the only way to interact with that generative AI effectively was to have your own. So first off, there's an access issue, right? Do I have access to my own personalized generative AI that's going to then talk to that company's generative AI and get through the system and knows how to do that? But then also, what kind of crazy effects are going to come from feedback loops of these two things talking to each other? So that's one that I think about, but there's tons more potential out there. There's, they really range into the realm of sci-fi, and a lot of them, similar to how we're talking about amplification effects with misinformation, a lot of them are feedback loops gone awry. So this is something that I'm going to admit is not my area of expertise, but something that is definitely being researched to try and understand and gate these effects before they go forward in a crazy way.
Okay, thank you, Stevie. I guess we're going to have the free version of generative AI and the premium version of it. Yes, please.
Yeah, hi, Sam Stockwell, Alan Turing Institute. We've been looking at a lot of emerging AI developments and kind of the risks to disinformation. And one of the early stage kind of developments we're looking at is this idea of autonomous intelligent agents. So as a comparison, whereas with ChatGPT and other large language models, you have to constantly add prompts and instructions, and you get static outputs. So, for instance, you'll get an image or a text or a video. With autonomous agents, you can basically set them an objective, and they will then go away and autonomously, without human oversight, create tasks and prioritize those tasks to complete the objective. So you can imagine, for instance, asking your AI agent to go on to Twitter and on Reuters feed and to summarize news from the last 24 hours. So it will figure out how it needs to get access to Twitter. It will then go through those feeds and it will summarize those messages and bring it back to you. With that being said, I know a lot of the talk today has been about the way in which generative AI is likely to exacerbate existing disinformation risks, and I totally agree with that. But if you had a scenario where you had an autonomous AI agent that was trained on an open source model, so the human user has access to the parameters that they could disable around content that's considered harmful, hate speech, etc., and it set it an objective to take over its social media account and to look on, say, a feed with Russian hashtags on the Ukrainian war, and essentially tell it to create a personalized strategy on any kind of user that's in that feed, target them with a specific message that's pro-Russian in nature. And so you have the prospect of an AI agent that, rather than being kind of controlled at every stage by the human, is essentially dynamically responding individually to users, and potentially for the first time you have an AI kind of model running a disinformation strategy. Does that now pose an entirely novel risk to disinformation? I appreciate this is very much in the hypothetical stages, but yeah, I'd be interested to hear, kind of just from speculation, what you guys think on that.
Let's assume that this agent is aware of human rights.
Aware of human rights?
Human rights, at least that, right? So what is going to happen there if it is autonomous and you set objectives?
Is it following human rights in this case? Or
I hope
Because
so.
if it doesn't, it wouldn't do all the things.
It's a good working assumption right now.
I feel like in the premise, it's not following human rights, especially.
Okay.
It's particularly there to manipulate.
Why is not following human rights? Yes.
Well, I mean, it's particular. Like, it sounds like in the premise of the question, you're essentially presenting an autonomous influencing machine, right? I mean, I feel like I don't want to take the mic from you because I feel like this is certainly, this is something I feel like anticipated in what you stated around whether or not it's a human or a bot, you moderate it, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I can.
No, go ahead, and then I'll add my comments.
Yeah, it's similar in terms of scale, and of course we know there are, say, Twitter bots and things like that. I think some of the risks that you pose are novel in that they are, it's personalized, and it's personalized. So look, there's of course political influence today that is personalized. You know, people call people and ask them, oh, you're voting for so-and-so, or oh, have you considered? I mean, I'm obviously, well, maybe American, that this happens all the time. So people get called and they say, oh, who are you voting for? If you're willing to talk about it, have you thought about this? And now, this takes time, right? This takes time, it takes effort, it takes resources in order to hire people to do that, or to gather the volunteers and so on. Now, in this potential, though very possible, and maybe even already exists scenario, it's cheap, right? It's just much cheaper. So, for example, out there are state actors. It's known, for example, that the Syrian regime has whole rooms full of people who report journalist content to try and alter our information space, say on Facebook or on Twitter. Now, instead of having to hire people, you have generative AI systems that can affect this space. This is a massive risk, and it's absolutely one that we need to be concerned about. And it is novel, both in its amplification, its scale, its cheapness, and
we will have it during the coming US elections.
Yeah.
Sarah, what's your take on the question?
First of all, I think it's helpful to have those threat ideations, the way you were describing. In fact, we at Meta do those things all the time and come up with possible scenarios so that we can test whether or not our policies and processes are at the right place and proactively do so to prepare for the next so to speak, next iteration of evolving risks. I think when you were describing your hypothetical, two ways in which I would sort of think about mitigating it is, again, in line with this threat ideation, is the red teaming. We see that a lot of large language models, before they are deployed, and this is also part of the commitments under White House, is to red team with external experts, not just internal experts. And I was just actually reading, Anthropic just released their red teaming exercise on biosecurity and bioweapons. So I do think people are thinking about it, and this is probably one method to try to do it.
Maybe Sarah, explain what red teaming is.
So red teaming is essentially you bring all the experts on a given topic, and I'm looking at the representative from the defense industry, and I work to misrepresent the concept, but essentially you bring together and you try to create adversarial ways of deploying the model, and then once you kind of understand ways in which you can deploy or even kind of test the model, you fine-tune the model and make sure that you are adjusting it in a way that it doesn't create the type of content, for example, or the type of behavior that you are trying to prevent. Correct me if that's correct.
No, I think that, that's right.
Yeah, so that's kind of one way in which I would think that it would be one mitigation tactic. And the second is sort of inherent to that is fine-tuning, where you have like humans in the loop, that they are sort of fine-tuning the model so it doesn't create that kind of risk that you are describing. The one thing I would also add that, again, we're very, very wired to think about risks, and we should, but when you were describing this agent, assuming this agent doesn't engage in this malicious actions, you might also think about this technology creating opportunities for, so to speak, marginalized, or to those ones who don't have the finances. Let's say if you are a party candidate and you want to run against a candidate that has a lot of funding, and you don't have that kind of resources to create marketing or to create, to even have your people, to volunteers to go and talk to, like, door to door to do those things, maybe you will rely on some of the agents to sort of create more equal level for different candidates. So I think there are lots of risks. There are also opportunities in terms of democratizing access.
Can I just add one thing?
Please.
Very quickly. So maybe one thing that does get kind of directly at your question is some kind, and this is an active area of research, some kind of watermarking. Right? Some kind of detection ability to say, you know, if this kind of thing showed up on Facebook, say, or Twitter or whatever, bright lights go off, like giant blaring things that say this is not real, you shouldn't trust this, it's like it's trying to manipulate you or whatever. Now, this is a really active area of investigation, particularly, say, around deepfakes. Something I saw recently, just to give an example of how something like this could work, I saw that Intel recently put out a deepfake detector that was quite interesting. What you're really looking for are differences between human and machine. And so with a deepfake detector, say you have a picture or an audio or video of someone talking, like Joe Biden talking. So what they did is they created a detector that could tell like the movement of blood under skin, basically, in the video. So it's not fully accurate, and basically evaluations and understanding accuracy is so important because the errors and telling someone that they're a deepfake when they're not is so problematic. There was a recent paper showing that ChatGPT was actually biased towards non-native English speakers. Or sorry, let me say that more correctly. Not ChatGPT especially, but ChatGPT detectors were biased towards against non-native English speakers. So this paper recently came out. So basically, these are new areas of research, and they need to be better. Thank you.
Okay, no problem. I think there are many questions, so I would ask the panel to be brief, please. Next question.
Hi, my name is Frances Haugen. I'm the founder of Beyond the Screen, and sometimes known as a whistleblower. My question is for Sarah. So your comments earlier, I think, are very in line with a lot of what Facebook has said around strategies for safety over the last 5 years, namely a heavy influence on content moderation. We have known for at least maybe 4 years that when you have feedback on a classifier, you can train generative systems to make content that will basically meet any goal function. In a world where we're about to have the right to know that our content was demoted or taken down, how does Facebook plan on adapting its content moderation systems, given that people will now be able to generate misinformation, hate speech, whatever, that doesn't trigger the moderation systems at Facebook?
I'm not quite sure I follow the question. I think the question is, let me paraphrase to make sure I understand it. I think the question is, people have the right to know how their content is moderated?
No. We've known that if you get that feedback, the generative AI can squiggle, make new things, such that it will now not trigger your system.
So basically the question is that if you will have future systems that are capable of bypassing your automatic moderation system, then I guess downstream you're going to have some people.
Yeah, so no, that's a great question. I would say I think it's premature to talk about in hypotheticals in terms of what can happen and where our content moderation techniques would be at that point. So I'm hesitant to say we will be able or not be able. I think that the realization is that as the systems evolve, so should our moderations.
Makes sense. Next question.
Right, thanks. So I think a lot of the discussion has been around generated content, but I'm curious if the panelists have any thoughts on the risks and benefits from generated code. So it seems like it's significantly expanded the ability to access various programming tools, and that might be a vector to get at one of the previous comments that was made, like I don't know how to code particularly well, but I can use generative AI to build a bot that does exactly what the guy behind me just said.
Democratizing coding. Benefits?
I'd be happy to, but I feel like you
Well, I mean, I'm not sure I have too much to say on it, other than it's not obvious to me that, I guess I tend to think about generating code not all that different than generating other content, right? To me, it's in some ways another form of speech or another form of expression. I mean, targeted with a specific goal in mind, right? And if you think about it that way, I'm not sure that it's obvious to me that it has a significant impact on disinformation specifically. I think where it does address is, where it probably does have an impact is a question we got earlier around self-directed models, right? And I think when we start thinking about the way that we will have multimodal models that are doing multiple topics and able to direct, clearly that opens up a whole new world of hypotheticals and possibilities. And so, I mean, I guess that's the starting point of how I think about it, although it's not obvious to me that the way you address that is any different than the way that we're going to continue to address all the other impacts that generative AI will have. And including, I think, the idea that, I don't want to call it an arms race, right? But I think we will be in a period of technology needing to match technology, right? AI models that are built to get around like content moderation and content moderation that adjusts. And I think it's far too early to say where that plays out, right? I think there have been early successes in image identification, and in deep synthesis, probably less so in written communication, right? But again, I think it's probably too early to say how that plays out and exactly what impact it has. To your question specifically, I would just say it feeds into the broader point about multimodal models and what they'll be able to accomplish. But again, I don't know that the risks are dramatically different. Other thoughts?
I mean, a quick thing that I'll say is that I think that this is an area where I see the democratization effects in terms of really making coding more accessible as mostly positive. I mean, I'm quite trained to like think direly about every application that's put in front of me, and so I can think of things, I mean, such as, say, and they're often around, say, like someone who's developing this, say, implanting perhaps bits of code. I haven't heard of this happening. I am kind of spitballing. But for the most part, kind of like interacting with these systems as a user, really interrogating what comes in front of you, what is generated when you prompt it. Say you created some code and you're trying to understand if it has any bugs, for example, or if it's the right way, or if there's a more efficient way. Whatever it gives you, you should always ask, is that what I asked for? Do I understand what's going on here? And further prompts to make sure that you understand what's going on. Yeah, I'll stop there to keep it brief, but I think for the most part, something I will say is that there is also a lot of being careful about what you put into them, because you are feeding data into a system. So I know that in the beginning, I think a lot of people from a lot of different companies were putting their development code into ChatGPT, for example, and companies need to react to that. But if you're trying to learn, yeah.
Sarah?
Yeah, I mean, I tend to agree with the code and democratization, and partly because I don't know how to code, and it seems so wonderful suddenly that a platform, a technology can do it. But the parallel to me is perhaps the jailbreaking, if that's the right parallel, where there are actually, for example, if you look at OpenAI's policies, there are actually policies against jailbreaking, and how it is enforced, I'm not quite sure. But that's sort of where I think we might do, again, some sort of red teaming to understand what are the ways in which you can prevent jailbreaking, and maybe some sort of code development to target certain things that you shouldn't otherwise would be in that category. But that's my uneducated guess, I would say.
Interesting. Never thought about it. Yeah, next question there.
So my question was on individual privacy rights and the data that's fed into generative AI models. So specifically thinking of the example of the NHS and the data store that has on national medical records, both on an individual and a holistic level. I was wondering what your perspectives were on how that data could be used, the potential pros and cons of feeding that level of private data into AI, and whether you think that the legislative and technical benefits from that would match up with the cons.
Yep. So I guess it's a kind of codes of conduct. So what happens if the National Health Service would decide to put inside these generative models private health data?
I mean, I'll be curious what everyone else thinks, because I'll be brief on this one. To me, I'd be less concerned about the question of what goes into there are lots of actually different questions about what goes into models. There are copyright questions, other interesting legal questions this is going to generate. I think on the privacy side, I'm a little bit would be less focused on what's going into the models than what comes out, right? I tend to think that training on vast data sets will have more benefits than not. Right, I do think, though, you need to control what's coming out of the models and frankly, what's being stored. And I think there are lots of different ways to address that topic that we probably don't have time for at the moment, but curious if you have different views.
I mean, something I'll say on what you said is training is certainly crucial. It's kind of in some ways, sort of the worldview that you're giving the automated system, that it's generating content off of, but also really paying attention to how these systems are evaluated is extremely crucial, and that's just a point that I kind of wanted to get across today, and to always ask, what are the limitations of these systems? How have they been evaluated? How good is that evaluation? What is represented in that evaluation, and so on. Now, to get at your question, and I can't kind of see with the lights exactly where you are, but certainly when you put information into, say, ChatGPT, that information is now available to, I mean, I don't work for OpenAI, I don't know, but like that information is going into their system. So it is probably something to worry about. I'm not a privacy expert, so I feel like I don't know as well the kind of levers there. But there are also aspects of like positives and significant negatives to personalization of these systems to our needs. I know we're getting close to time.
So maybe
quickly.
just to kind of wrap up the privacy question, I think it's a super important question. It's like fundamental. To me, privacy and copyright are the thorniest questions when it comes to this conversation. The way I think about the privacy question is kind of front end and back end. So front end, making sure that you don't rely on private information when you are training the models. And the second is back end. If there was a violation of some sort, then there is a transparency. Big platforms, big tech have been releasing reports around like if governments are asking for information or if there was some sort of security breaches. And I think that might be a model that we might be wanting to consider for companies like OpenAI to think through in terms of transparency reporting. But otherwise, I think it's a very important question and gets at the core of some of the challenges that we will be facing. And just maybe last point, I know that actually OpenAI does have ability to make sure that your history, your conversation history is not saved, and then you can also opt in for privacy settings in which your data is not going to fit the model. So there are ways in which you can actually mitigate some of the concerns that have been raised.
If you trust them. On that note, let me just thank the panel, the super interactive panel. I asked them to take as many questions as possible, and they did it. So thanks so much, guys, for that. And I will ask a round of applause as well.